Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a relationship where you're giving your all, speaking your truth, showing your heart, yet the more love you offer, the more distant they become? It's like chasing someone in a fog. Just when you think you're close enough to connect, they vanish. Let me be brutally honest with you. It's not always about how much you love them. Sometimes it's about how your emotional patterns, without you realizing, are activating their deepest fears. You're not the villain, they're not broken, but something between you both is wired for war, not connection. And today, we're going to rip that pattern out by the roots. You can love someone with all your heart, pour everything into the relationship, and still find yourself facing a wall of silence, distance, or cold withdrawal. That doesn't mean your love is wrong or that you're too much. It means something deeper is at play. Love alone is not the answer when emotional safety is missing. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, love doesn't always feel like comfort. Sometimes it feels like a threat. And that's the hard truth many people miss. When you express emotion with intensity, when you seek closeness with urgency, when you push for connection in moments they're pulling away, it doesn't feel safe to them. It feels overwhelming. The wiring in their brain is built for self-protection, not vulnerability. Avoidants often grew up in environments where emotional intimacy was inconsistent, invasive, or even manipulative. So to them, closeness equals risk, emotional dependency equals danger, and love, as you express it, can activate every part of their nervous system that says, get out, protect yourself, don't lose control. What's tragic is that your emotional presence is meant as a gift, but to them, it can feel like pressure. And they're not wrong or broken for feeling that. That's their conditioning. That's their trauma response. Just like you may have been taught that connection heals, they were taught through pain that connection hurts. So when you raise your voice because you're hurt, when you ask repeatedly to talk about what's wrong, when you cry and plead for them to open up, they don't feel your heart. They feel their walls going up. They don't hear love. They hear, I'm losing control again. And that's why they shut down. It's not personal. It's survival. And the only way to meet them in that space is to change the way you love, not the amount. That means staying calm when they get quiet. That means being soft when they become cold. That means backing off emotionally, not to punish them, but to give them space to breathe. When an avoidant feels safe, when they sense no emotional demands, no agenda, no pressure, they begin to come forward, slowly and on their own terms. The paradox is powerful. The less you chase, the more they begin to trust. It's not about playing hard to get. It's about creating an emotional atmosphere that tells their nervous system, you're not trapped, you're not being controlled, you're free to connect if and when you're ready. That's how love starts to feel safe for both of you. You may not realize it, but every time you seek emotional connection with urgency, especially when your partner is withdrawing, you could be unintentionally escalating their fear response. What you see as love, effort, or clarity can be perceived by an avoidant partner as emotional invasion. This isn't because they don't care or aren't invested. It's because their nervous system interprets emotional pursuit differently than yours. When you try to get closer to soothe your anxiety, to fix the growing silence, or to gain reassurance, it can feel like pressure to them, an emotional intensity they're not ready or equipped to process. Avoidants are hypersensitive to anything that resembles emotional control or enmeshment. So when your tone becomes desperate, when the questions start to pile up, what are you thinking? Why won't you talk to me? Are we okay? Their internal response is often panic, not peace. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your behavior is unintentionally pushing against their core fear, the loss of autonomy. The truth is, emotional pursuit, especially when repeated or intense, can feel like an attack on their space. And when that happens, their instinct is not to lean in, it's to get away. This doesn't mean you should suppress your emotions, but it does mean that if your go-to strategy in moments of disconnection is to push harder, explain more, or demand clarity, then you're likely deepening the emotional gap rather than closing it. The key here is regulation, not silence, but balance. Can you sit with your discomfort without making it their job to fix it? Can you express your needs in a way that invites rather than pressures? This is the emotional work that creates space for real connection to happen. Because here's what happens on a deeper level. When you pursue, you signal that something is wrong and must be resolved immediately. That urgency can send their nervous system into overdrive. And once they feel unsafe, they won't respond with logic. They'll respond with distance. The more you try to reach them in that state, the more they shut down. What you perceive as love becomes misinterpreted as emotional demand. And their retreat reinforces your anxiety. It becomes a painful loop. To change this cycle, the answer isn't to stop reaching out completely, but to shift how you do it. It's in the tone, the timing, and the energy behind your approach. Calm, grounded presence is far more effective than emotional intensity. Creating moments of quiet safety, not just more conversation, gives the avoidant partner space to return on their own. That's when healing can begin. When connection is chosen, not forced. When you're in a relationship with an avoidant partner, one of the most misunderstood dynamics is how easily their fear of losing control can be triggered. You might not even recognize you're doing it. It could be a certain tone of voice, a repeated question, a need for reassurance, or even your silence laced with expectation. To someone with an avoidant attachment style, these things can all feel like pressure, not because you're controlling them directly, but because any strong emotional energy directed their way activates an old internal alarm, the fear that someone else is going to take over their emotional space. Avoidants typically grew up in environments where control equaled stability. Perhaps their caregivers were emotionally unpredictable, manipulative, or even invasive. Maybe they were only shown love when they complied or performed. As a result, they learned that the safest way to stay in control was to keep their emotions private, their needs minimal, and their independence intact. So when you, as a loving partner, begin to express emotional intensity or needs for closeness, it isn't received as intimacy. It's received as risk. The energy behind your emotion might feel to them like it's demanding a response, and that response in their mind could mean sacrificing the one thing they value most, their sense of control. And that's why your avoidant partner might shut down when you raise your voice, even if it's not in anger. That's why they might retreat when you cry, even though your tears are a plea for connection. It's not that they don't care, it's that their nervous system is screaming, don't lose control. In their inner world, giving in to emotional moments can feel like surrendering their identity or being consumed by someone else's emotional storm. This doesn't mean you need to walk on eggshells, but it does mean that your emotional expression should come from a grounded place, not a reactive one. The more self-regulated you are, the more safe and spacious your presence becomes. And that safety is what invites an avoidant partner to slowly come forward. Because when they don't feel forced to respond, when they aren't pushed into emotional corners, they finally begin to feel free within the relationship. Control for them is not about power over you. It's about protecting themselves. But when they start to trust that your presence won't rob them of their autonomy, that your emotions aren't weapons, and that your love doesn't come with pressure, that's when the door to deeper connection opens. They begin to relax. They begin to engage. They begin to share, not because they were told to, but because they want to. And that shift changes everything. When you love someone who leans avoidant, your natural instinct might be to offer frequent reassurance. You might say things like, I'm not going anywhere. You can trust me. Or, we're okay, right? And to you, these words are soothing. They're meant to calm the waters, to show up with love and steadiness. But for someone with an avoidant attachment style, especially one who hasn't done deep inner work, those words can have the opposite effect. Not because they don't want to be reassured, but because deep down, reassurance can feel like an expectation they're not ready to meet. It can feel like pressure to respond in kind, to match your emotional depth, or to behave in ways that mirror your sense of safety when they're not there yet. The avoidant mind often interprets frequent reassurance as subtle emotional demand. If you're always reminding them that you're committed or seeking confirmation that everything's okay, they might feel that they're being pulled into a depth they're not ready to enter. It can trigger the feeling of being trapped. Because the truth is, avoidants aren't just afraid of abandonment, they're also afraid of engulfment, of losing themselves in someone else's emotional world. So every time you try to reassure them, they might hear, now it's your turn to show up in the same way. And if they're not ready to do that, they begin to pull back, not because they're rejecting you, but because they're trying to preserve their internal space. This isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of how they've learned to stay safe. What they respond to most is not spoken words, but demonstrated consistency. It's in your calm presence, your emotional self-regulation, your ability to give them space without resentment. When they see that you can be grounded even when they retreat, that you're not chasing them with emotional urgency, they begin to feel less pressure and more trust. Trust that you won't abandon yourself in trying to get close to them. Trust that they can be themselves without needing to perform a version of closeness they haven't yet developed. So instead of constantly reassuring with words, try embodying the reassurance. Be the safe space, not the echo of expectation. Avoidants are watching not just what you say, but how you react when they don't immediately respond the way you hope. The more non-reactive, emotionally anchored, and self-fulfilled you are, the more likely they are to let down their guard. They begin to understand, subconsciously, that your love doesn't require performance. And that's when they begin to trust not just you, but the entire idea of connection. In many relationships with an avoidant partner, there's a painful pattern that plays out again and again, a push-pull cycle that leaves both people confused, exhausted, and emotionally raw. You want connection. You reach out, you express, you try to bridge the gap, but the more you pursue, the more they seem to pull away. It feels personal. It feels like rejection. But what most people don't realize is that this is not a reflection of your value. It's a subconscious dance between two wounded attachment styles. The anxious-avoidant loop isn't driven by logic or even intent. It's driven by emotional survival strategies that were formed long before either of you met. Every time you feel disconnected, your instinct may be to close that gap immediately. Maybe you send a message, ask a question, try to talk things out. And when they don't respond the way you hope, when they go quiet, seem emotionally flat, or avoid the topic, your nervous system flares up. So you try harder, you call again, you raise your emotional volume, you chase. But here's the twist. That chasing doesn't bring them closer. It triggers their deepest fear, being emotionally smothered, losing control, and being expected to give what they haven't learned to access. So they pull away, creating more distance, more silence, more frustration. You then feel abandoned, unseen, maybe even unloved. That hurt builds. And without realizing it, both of you are reacting not just to each other, but to old emotional wounds. You're dancing the same roles over and over again. The pursuer and the distancer, the anxious and the avoidant, both trying to feel safe in ways that trigger the other. And this pattern won't break on its own. It doesn't fix itself with time. In fact, the longer it continues, the deeper the grooves become. Breaking this dance requires something radical: personal accountability. You can't change your partner's attachment style, but you can become aware of your own responses. You can stop reacting and start observing. You can learn to hold your emotional center even when they retreat. That's not detachment, it's emotional power. And when one person in the cycle breaks their role, the whole dance begins to change. Suddenly, there's space for curiosity instead of fear. There's room for presence instead of pressure. You're no longer trying to fix or chase. You're choosing conscious action over unconscious reaction. And that choice can disrupt years of emotional programming for both of you. It can turn a pattern of pain into a process of healing. Because when one person wakes up from the emotional loop, the relationship finally has a chance to become something new. If you truly want to build a lasting, emotionally fulfilling relationship with someone who leans avoidant, the work doesn't begin with learning how to handle them. It begins with learning how to master yourself. Emotional mastery is not about becoming emotionless or cold. It's about developing the ability to feel everything without being controlled by it. And that, more than anything else, is what creates transformation in a relationship with an avoidant partner. Because here's the truth. Avoidants don't trust chaos. They don't open up to emotional volatility. They don't feel safe when energy is all over the place, when conversations are emotionally charged, or when every disagreement becomes a crisis. What calms their system, what invites them to slowly lean in, is steady energy, calmness, groundedness, predictability in your emotional state. Most people believe they need to change the avoidant, get them to communicate more, express more, show up more. But the more you try to pull that from them, the more they instinctively resist. You can't force emotional availability. You have to inspire it by creating an atmosphere where their nervous system feels unthreatened. That atmosphere doesn't come from words, it comes from your emotional state. When you stop relying on their response to determine your sense of worth, when you stop needing constant validation to feel secure, you shift the entire emotional dynamic. You stop becoming reactive. You stop trying to force connection. And in that shift, you become the source of safety. This is emotional leadership. This is the inner work that most people avoid because it's not as visible, not as dramatic, but it's powerful. You don't win an avoidance trust by being perfect. You win it by being consistent, calm, and non-threatening over time. When you show them that your love is not rooted in emotional dependency, that your sense of self doesn't collapse when they take space, they begin to see you differently. Not as someone trying to control or overwhelm them, but as someone who knows how to hold their own emotional experience with maturity. This doesn't mean suppressing your needs. It means expressing them from a place of self-respect rather than panic. It means understanding that love is a choice, not a demand. And it means being so emotionally centered that their silence doesn't shake your foundation. That's when they start to come closer, not because you pushed, but because you became the one place they don't have to run from. Let's face the truth with courage. Loving someone with an avoidant attachment style isn't easy. It's filled with confusion, mixed signals, and emotional highs and lows that leave you questioning yourself. But once you begin to understand the deeper dynamics at play, what triggers their fears, what makes them shut down, what makes them feel unsafe, you begin to see that their behavior isn't about you. It's about their past, their emotional wiring, their unspoken fears. And suddenly, you stop personalizing their distance and start approaching the relationship with deeper awareness. That awareness alone is a powerful turning point because it puts the power back in your hands. You're no longer blindly reacting, you're consciously responding. You begin to understand that your emotional intensity, though rooted in love, can sometimes come across as pressure. That your need for closeness, though natural, may trigger their need for space. You realize that what they often fear isn't the relationship, but the loss of control, the feeling of being engulfed or expected to show up emotionally before they're ready. And instead of reacting with anxiety or hurt, you learn to pause, breathe, and create space. You learn to speak with calm instead of urgency, to express your feelings without making them responsible for fixing them. That emotional shift changes everything. It transforms the atmosphere from one of fear and tension to one of safety and stability. The real transformation doesn't happen by getting your partner to change overnight. It happens when you change, when you build emotional mastery, regulate your nervous system, and stop depending on their response to validate your worth. That inner strength becomes the foundation of a new dynamic. You stop chasing, you stop collapsing into emotional spirals, and from that space, your partner, who once felt overwhelmed by closeness, begins to experience connection in a new light, not as something that threatens their autonomy, but as something that honors it. They begin to trust not just you, but the idea that love can exist without control, pressure, or fear. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of this journey, discovering that true connection doesn't come from forcing closeness, but from creating the kind of emotional environment where closeness becomes a natural response. When you lead with stability, you invite safety. When you embody peace, you inspire openness. And when you become the partner who no longer reacts from fear, but shows up from a place of grounded love, that's when you stop emotionally triggering your avoidant partner and start becoming the person they can finally feel safe to love. Thank you so much for spending your time and energy with me today. If this message resonated with you, if it gave you clarity, comfort, or even a moment of truth, then I honor the strength it takes to face these patterns and grow through them. Remember, healing doesn't happen overnight, but every step you take in understanding yourself and your partner brings you closer to the kind of love that feels safe, secure, and real. Keep showing up for your growth, even when it's hard. You're not alone in this journey. If you found value in this content, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support means the world and helps us keep creating content that speaks to the heart of real relationships.